Zijin walked into prison 5 years ago without resistance, without excuses, without turning back. He accepted a sentence meant to erase him from the world. Not because he was guilty, but because it was the only way to keep Damsu alive. While others called it weakness, Zijin called it loyalty. Prison carved that loyalty into scars, into sleepless nights, broken bones, and a silence so deep it sharpened his mind instead of breaking it. Every year behind bars hardened him, but one belief kept him breathing. When he walked out, she would be waiting. That promise was his anchor, the thin line separating survival from surrender. When the gates finally opened, the world greeted him like a stranger. The underworld had moved on, his name whispered like a rumor instead of a threat. Zijin stepped into freedom wearing black, his trench coat heavy, a fresh scar burning across his forehead. A reminder that even at the end, someone had still tried to bury him. He didn't look back at the prison. His first step wasn't toward revenge or power, but toward the woman he had sacrificed everything for. And that was when he saw her, Damsu glowing under warm lights, dressed in red silk, laughing with champagne in her hand. She wasn't alone. She was seated beside Ganju, the man who had orchestrated Zijin's fall, the man who now wore his throne like it belonged to him. Damsu leaned in close, smiling without restraint, her body language easy, intimate, unburdened by guilt. Something inside Zijin went completely still. This wasn't heartbreak. Heartbreak was loud. This was colder, final. In that moment, he understood that prison hadn't stolen 5 years from him. The choice she made had. He turned away without confrontation, without rage, because anger was reckless and recklessness was for men who lost. What replaced it was something far more dangerous, clarity. Blood mode is activated not as fury, but as precision. Ganju was laughing, unaware his empire had already begun collapsing, and Damsu had yet to realize that safety bought with betrayal always demands payment. The king had returned. And this time, forgiveness was not part of the story. The first year did not break him, but it taught him how close a man could come to disappearing without dying. Prison stripped Zijin of everything familiar within days. His name meant nothing here. His history was irrelevant. The walls were indifferent, the nights endless, and the men around him desperate to carve identity out of violence. On his second night, someone whispered his old title with mockery. On the third, someone tried to stab him in the shower. Blood slid down the drain and thin. Pink rivers, not his. That was the moment the block learned something important. Zijin did not threaten and he did not boast. He simply ended things. After that, no one rushed him. They watched. They waited. Fear replaced curiosity. Still, survival came at a cost. The second year etched pain into his bones. Fights were no longer spontaneous. They were calculated. Ambushes carried out when guards turned their heads. He slept lightly, ate quickly, learned which sounds meant danger and which meant nothing at all. A blade caught him in the ribs one night. Shallow but burning. Another time, a boot connected with his skull hard enough to split skin and blur the world. The scar on his forehead healed crooked, a permanent mark of the price he paid for standing alone. Medical care came late. Sometimes not at all. He learned to stitch himself with torn fabric and patience. Pain became background noise. By the third year, he was a presence. Men stepped aside without being told. Conflicts dissolved when he entered a room, not because he demanded obedience, but because chaos did not survive around him. He kept his eyes lowered, his voice quiet, his movements economical. At night, when the cell block settled into murmurs and coughs, he allowed himself one indulgence, memory. Damsu's face, her hands gripping his sleeve the night they took him away. Her promise, whispered through tears, that she would wait. That promise became ritual. He replayed it like prayer, like armor. It was the only softness he permitted himself. The fourth year tried to poison that belief. Letters slowed, then stopped. News from outside arrived fractured. Names passed between inmates, power shifts spoken like rumors. Ganju's name surfaced more often than it should have. Each time, it lodged in Zijin's chest like unfinished business. Doubt crept in during the loneliest hours, asking questions he refused to answer. Had she been threatened? Had she been protected? Or had time done what enemies couldn't? He never let the thoughts finish. Hope was dangerous, but despair was lethal. He chose discipline instead. By the 5th year, he was no longer counting days. He was counting heartbeats. His body had changed, leaner, harder, built for endurance rather than dominance. His emotions had narrowed into something precise and controlled. He no longer dreamed of freedom. He prepared for it. When the gates finally opened, he would not walk out as the man who went in. He would walk out as something refined by silence, sharpened by loss, and fueled by a promise that still burned, untested, unquestioned. He believed she was waiting. That belief was the reason he survived, and it was the reason what came next would destroy everything. Damsu did not change all at once. She changed slowly, the way people do when they're left alone for too long. When Zijin went to prison, she tried to live exactly the way he had asked her to. She stayed quiet. She stayed hidden. She lived inside the safety he had built for her. Guards watching from a distance, money appearing when she needed it, doors opening without questions. Every night, she reminded herself why he had done this. He had taken 5 years of darkness, so she could live in the light. Waiting was her duty. Enduring was her promise. At first, the city felt hostile. Every knock made her tense. Every unfamiliar face felt dangerous. She slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. When loneliness crept in, she pushed it away by remembering Zijin's eyes on the other side of the prison glass. Steady, certain, unafraid. He had told her to live. He had told her not to waste her life waiting. She clung to those words even when the nights felt endless. But time is cruel to people who stand still. The invitation started quietly. Dinners framed as concern. Conversations wrapped in kindness. People spoke to her about safety, about the future, about how hard it must be to survive without the man who once protected her. She refused at first. Then she accepted one. Then another. Each time, she told herself it meant nothing. Each time it became easier. That was when Ganju appeared. He never pressured her. He never demanded anything. He stayed just close enough to feel safe and just distant enough to feel respectful. He spoke gently. He listened. He never asked her to forget Zijin. He simply spoke as if Zijin belonged to the past, as if waiting was foolish, as if survival required adaptation. Slowly, fear gave way to comfort. By the 3rd year, Damsu no longer dressed a hide. She stopped choosing clothes that helped her disappear. One afternoon, she bought the red dress. She told herself it was just fabric, but when she wore it, people looked at her differently. She felt seen, not as someone protected by a name, but as someone powerful on her own. Compliments followed her everywhere. Laughter came easier. Silence became something she avoided instead of endured. Ganju was always there, steady, unshaken. When whispers followed her, he stood beside her without hesitation. When doubt surfaced late at night, he offered distraction instead of answers. Slowly, protection turned into presence. Presence turned into reliance. The night everything shifted, she wore the red dress again. Warm light filled the room. Glasses clinked. Music softened her thoughts. Ganju leaned toward her, saying something unimportant, and she laughed, openly, freely. In that moment, she was not a woman waiting for a man behind bars. She was not counting days. She was not afraid. She did not know the prison gates had opened. She did not know a man had walked out carrying 5 years of pain and hope. She only knew the red dress fit perfectly, and that sometimes survival feels like happiness, until the past comes back to collect its debt. The gala was a sea of moving shadows and expensive perfume. But for Zijin, the world had narrowed down to a single point of red. standing in the darkened balcony above the ballroom. He adjusted his cuffs, his knuckles still scarred from 5 years of prison concrete. He had survived the cage for her. He had taken the blame for a crime he didn't commit just to keep Damsu's name clean. Every night in that cell, he had pictured her waiting, her heart as loyal as the day he left. But the woman below was a stranger. Damsu moved through the crowd, not as a grieving lover, but as a queen. The red dress she wore was like a flame, drawing every eye in the room. It was beautiful, but it was a beauty paid for by his enemy. Beside her stood Ganju, the man Zijin had once trusted like a brother. Ganju's hand didn't just rest on her waist. It claimed her. He leaned in, whispering into her ear, and Damsu didn't pull away. She smiled, a cold, practiced smile that cut deeper into Zijin's chest than any prison shiv ever could. The blood mo didn't start with a roar. It started with a terrifying, icy silence. Zijin watched as Ganju handed her a glass of champagne, their fingers lingering together. The betrayal was complete. The man he had mentored had stolen his chair, his company, and now his woman. Zijin's vision began to tint with a dark, vengeful heat. He realized now that his sacrifice hadn't been a shield for her. It had been an opportunity for them. They thought he was a ghost, a memory buried behind iron bars. They thought the Mafia CEO was broken. He stepped back into the shadows, his face a mass of stone. He didn't want to just kill Ganju. He wanted to dismantle the world they had built together. He would let them enjoy their music and their wine for a few moments longer. But as Zijin turned away from the railing, his eyes glowed with a predatory promise. He had spent 5 years in hell for a lie, and now he was going to make sure they burned in the truth. The return wasn't just about reclaiming a title. It was about showing them what happens when you trigger the monster you were supposed to love. The city was quiet, but for Zijin, the silence was a weapon. He didn't come back with a loud bang or a parade. He came back like a shadow slipping under a door. He stood in front of the massive glass tower that held his name, or at least it used to. 5 years ago, he had built this empire. Now his enemy, Ganju, sat at the top. Zijin didn't go to the front desk where the security guards stood with their shiny badges. Instead, he walked toward a rusty service door in the back alley. He remembered the secret code he had programmed himself years ago. With a soft click, the door opened. The building still remembered its true master. Inside, the air smelled like floor wax and expensive air filters. Zijin moved through the dark hallways with a ghost touch. He entered the main server room. The giant computers hummed, their small green lights blinking like tiny eyes. Ganju had changed the passwords, but Zijin knew the back door he had hidden in the software long ago. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Simple lines of code appeared on the screen. Suddenly, he was in. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for secrets. He saw a bank record, hidden emails, and private photos. He saw how Ganju had been stealing from the company to buy Damsu those expensive red dresses. Zijin's face stayed as hard as stone, but his eyes burned. He copied everything onto a small black drive and vanished before the system could even send an alert. Later that night, he went to the shipping docks. This was the dark side of his business, where the real power was kept. Huge metal crates were stacked like mountains under the moonlight. 3 of Ganju's toughest guards were smoking near a warehouse. These were men who used to work for Zijin. Zijin stepped out of fog. The guards froze. One man dropped his cigarette, his jaw hanging open. He reached for his gun, but his hand shook so much he couldn't grab it. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Zijin said. His voice was quiet, but it sounded like a warning from a grave. The guards didn't fight. They didn't scream. They saw the look in Zijin's eyes, the look of a man who had survived 5 years of hell and was ready to hand out the bill. They slowly stepped aside. They didn't need to be told that the king was back. By morning, Zijin was sitting in a small, dusty cafe across the street from his tower. He watched Ganju's car pull up to the front. He watched Ganju walk inside, acting like he owned the world. Zijin took a slow sip of his bitter coffee. He had the keys to the building. the secrets in the computers, and the loyalty of the men in the shadows. Ganju thought he was safe at the top of his throne, but he didn't realize the floor was already missing. The question wasn't if Zijin would take it all back. The question was how much blood would be left on the floor when he was done. The shift in Zijin wasn't like a sudden explosion. It was more like a fire going out, leaving only cold, hard ice behind. As he sat in his dark room, looking at the files on his laptop, the man who had gone to prison for love finally disappeared. Seeing Damsu in that red dress was a final straw. She wasn't just wearing a dress. She was wearing a trophy from his enemy. The pain he felt didn't make him cry or scream. Instead, it turned into a strange, scary calmness. This was blood mode. It was a state of mind where his heart stopped feeling, and his brain started working like a computer. He didn't hate Ganju anymore. To Zijin, hate was a waste of time. Now, he saw Ganju as a mistake that needed to be erased. He looked at the maps of Ganju's business routes. He didn't see ships or trucks. He saw math. He knew exactly which person called to make Ganju lose $50 million in a single hour. He looked at the names of the city leaders Ganju had paid off. He didn't feel betrayed. He just calculated how much more money it would take to make them turn on Ganju. Zijin stood up and walked to a mirror. He looked at his face. He saw the thin scars from prison in his cold, empty eyes. He picked up a sharp razor and began to shave. His hand didn't shake at all. He was as steady as a statue. In blood mode. People weren't people anymore. They were just pieces on a game board. He started planning his next move for the big party, the next night. He didn't plan based on anger. He planned based on what would destroy Ganju completely. He knew every security camera and every secret door in that building. He had built them. After all, he thought about Damsu one last time. He didn't remember her sweet voice or the way she used to hold him. He only saw her as Ganju's greatest weakness. If she was the thing Ganju loved most, then she was the weight that would pull Ganju down to the bottom of the ocean. Zijin felt a chilling peace. The man who went to prison 5 years ago was dead and buried. The CEO who had come back was something much more dangerous. He put on his black suit jacket and straightened his tie. He was ready to start the countdown. He wasn't just coming for his company. He was coming to turn their perfect world into a nightmare. The only question left was, who would be standing when the sun came up? Ganju didn't hear a single alarm, but his world was falling apart. It started with a phone call at 4 a.m. His biggest shipment of electronics and black market goods had been seized at the docks. The harbor master, a man Ganju had paid off for years, suddenly didn't recognize his name. Then came the emails. The bank accounts he used to hide his stolen millions were being frozen one by one. On his computer screen, the numbers turned red, dropping so fast it looked like a countdown to 0. Inside the office tower, the air felt heavy with fear. The employees didn't look Ganju in the eye anymore. They whispered in the break rooms, sensing that the man in the expensive suit was losing his grip. Ganju stormed through the halls, screaming for answers, but his assistants only looked at their shoes. The power he had stolen was leaking out of the building like water through a cracked vase. By noon, the board of directors called for an emergency meeting. These were the same men who had bowed to Ganju for 5 years. Now, they sat around the long mahogany table with cold, stony faces. They had all received anonymous packages that morning, files containing proof of Ganju's dirty deals and the way he had framed Zijin. The evidence was so simple and clear that no lawyer could hide it. Ganju looked at their faces and realized he wasn't their leader anymore. He was a liability. The rot spread even deeper into the streets. Ganju's toughest street captain stopped answering his calls. When he finally tracked one down, the man just laughed. "The word is out, Ganju," the captain said. "The ghost is back, and he's already paid us double to just stay home." Ganju sat in his office, the same office he had taken from Zijin, and realized the silence was the most terrifying part. There were no sirens, no police at the door, just the quiet sound of his empire crumbling. He poured a glass of whiskey, but his hand finally started to shake. He looked at the security monitors and saw the cameras flickering out one by one. The building was going dark. He reached for his phone to call Damsu, needing to hear her voice, needing to know he still had his prize. But when the line picked up, there was no greeting. There was only the sound of a slow, steady breath on the other end, a breath that sounded exactly like a man who had waited 5 years for this moment. Ganju dropped the phone as the realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just losing his money or his title. He was being hunted by a man who had already won. The golden life Damsu had lived for 5 years was starting to feel like a beautiful lie. She sat in the back of her expensive car, the red silk of her dress rustling as she moved to the world. She was the queen of the city, a woman who had everything. But inside, she felt a strange cold wind blowing. Lately, the air felt heavy. When she walked past people, they didn't look at her with respect anymore. They looked at her with pity, like they were watching a tragedy she didn't know she was in. When she stepped into her luxury penthouse, the silence was deafening. The lights were already on, casting long, lonely shadows across the room. On the white marble kitchen counter, she found something that didn't belong. It wasn't a diamond necklace or a box of chocolates from Ganju. It was a dusty, old envelope that looked like it had been through a war. Damsu's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Inside the envelope were letters, dozens of them. They were the letters she had poured her soul into, writing to Zijin every single week while he was in prison. Every one of them was marked, "Return to sender." She had spent 5 years thinking he had abandoned her, that he had thrown her love away. But now she saw the truth in her own handwriting. Someone had intercepted them. Someone had made sure he never heard her voice. Next to the letters sat a small, black USB drive. It looked like a tiny, dark heart. She plugged it into her laptop, her fingers trembling so much she could barely hit the keys. A video flickered to life. It was grainy security footage from 5 years ago. She saw Ganju, the man she had shared a bed with, the man she thought had saved her. She watched in horror as he sneaked into Zijin's office, a snake in a suit. She saw him plant the fake evidence that sent Zijin to a cage. Ganju wasn't her savior. He was a thief who had stolen her life and sold her the pieces back as protection. Then, the video changed to a live camera feed from the building's lobby downstairs. Damsu gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw the tough security guards, men who were paid a fortune to be Ganju's loyal dogs, suddenly freeze. They didn't pull their guns. They didn't shout. Instead, they stood perfectly straight and bowed their heads in deep, terrifying respect. A man in a long, dark coat walked past them. He didn't show an ID. He didn't say a word. He walked with slow, powerful stride that made the very floor seem to tremble. It was a predator's walk, the stride of a king who had climbed out of hell to reclaim his crown. Even from the back, she knew that silhouette. It was Zijin. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the counter, the sound making her jump. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. Her breath hitched as she read the words that shattered her world. "That red dress looks beautiful on you, Damsu, but red is the color of debt, and I am coming to collect. I'm in the elevator." Damsu stared at the door. She heard the faint, musical ding of the elevator arriving on her floor. Her heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. Was Zijin coming to rescue her, or was he coming to punish her for being the trophy of his enemy? She realized then that her beautiful penthouse wasn't a palace. It was a cage, and the most dangerous man she had ever loved was standing right outside the bars. The penthouse door didn't burst open with a bang. Instead, it slid aside with a soft, mechanical hiss that sounded like a final, dying breath. Damsu stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape a cage. Zijin stepped inside, and the temperature of the room seemed to plummet. He didn't look like a man who had been rotting in a cell for 5 years. He looked like a god of vengeance carved from midnight stone. His suit was dark, his eyes were darker, and as his gaze landed on Damsu, She felt the crushing weight of every secret, every lie, and every lonely night she had spent in another man's arms. The silence between them was heavy, thick with the ghosts of the letters he never received and the life that had been stolen from them. "Zijin," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry glass. He didn't move toward her with open arms. He walked through the room with a slow, predatory grace, his eyes scanning the expensive art and a glass of untouched wine. Finally, his eyes settled on the red silk of her dress. "I told you it was a debt," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sent shivers down her spine. "You look like a queen, Damsu, but your throne is built on the bones of my sacrifice." Before she could beg for his forgiveness, the private elevator behind Zijin opened again. Ganju stepped out, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stopped dead, his mouth hanging open as he saw the man he thought he had buried forever. The room felt like a battlefield where love, betrayal, and greed were finally meeting face to face. "Zijin, please." "I can explain," Ganju stammered, his voice thin and pathetic. He reached for his pocket, but his hand shook so violently he couldn't even find his phone. "I did it for the company. I did it for her. You were gone. Someone had to take care of her." Zijin's expression didn't flicker. He didn't scream or roar. He simply watched Ganju as if he were an ant under a boot. "You didn't take care of her, Ganju. You bought her with my blood." He turned his icy eyes back to Damsu, his gaze cutting deeper than any blade. "And you? Did you believe the lies because they were comfortable, or did you just prefer to feel his silk over the memory of my touch?" Damsu felt hot tears spill over. "I thought you hated me. They told me you refused to see me." She took a step toward him, her hands reaching out, but he remained a statue of cold iron. "The letters you sent are on the counter, Damsu. The proof of his treason is on the screen," Zijin said, his voice devoid of warmth. He looked back at Ganju, and a terrifying light ignited in his eyes, the blood mode taking full control. "You stole my life, Ganju. Now, I'm going to watch you drown in the ruins of yours. Not because I'm going to pull a trigger, but because I've already taken back the world you thought you owned." In that moment, Ganju's phone began to scream with alerts, the sound of his empire finally hitting the floor. As they stood in the wreckage of their lives, Damsu realized the most painful truth of all. The man she loved had finally come home, but the heart he once had for her had been burned away in the fire of his betrayal. The chaos in the penthouse eventually faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Ganju was gone, dragged away by the very men he had once paid to protect him, men who now looked at Zijin with a terrified reverence reserved for a ghost that had returned to claim the living. Damsu stood by the window, her red dress now looking like a shroud of failed dreams. She looked at Zijin, waiting for a spark of the old love to return, but his eyes remained as cold as a winter sea. "I can't go back to who I was, Damsu," he said, his voice echoing in the hollow room. "That man died in a cell, while you were dancing in this city's lights." He didn't wait for her to answer. He turned and walked out, leaving the past behind him. The next morning, the city woke up to a new world. The news was a storm of headlines about Ganju's sudden arrest and the miraculous resurrection of the true Mafia CEO. But Zijin didn't care about the news. He was already back in his office, the one at the very top of the tower. He sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of the empire beneath him. It was no longer just a company. It was a fortress built on the lessons of betrayal. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, and his heart felt even more so. But as he stared out at the skyline, he felt a power he had never known before. He was no longer a man who loved too much or trusted too easily. He was a king who had survived the fire and come out made of iron. The board members arrived for the morning briefing, filing in with their heads bowed, terrified to even breathe too loudly. They saw a man who was undefeated and unshakable. Zijin didn't need to raise his voice to command them. His presence alone was a threat. He laid out the new rules of his reign with a chilling, surgical precision. The weakness that had once led him to prison was gone, replaced by a ruthless clarity. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk, Zijin stood by the glass wall. He looked down at the streets below, where millions of people lived their small, fragile lives. He was alone at the peak, isolated by his power and his scars. But as he adjusted his watch and felt the cold steel of his new reality, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Mafia CEO was reborn, not as a hero, but as a legend that the city would fear for generations to come. He was the master of the shadows, the king of the light, and finally, completely undefeated.